like, and make sure to engage in comments. Also, share this video to your friends and story lovers and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real horror stories like this. It started as a simple getaway idea. Ryan, Mark, Ethan, and Luke were just a group of friends looking for a fun weekend to break the monotony of their daily lives. They were all in their mid-20s, balancing the grind of work and school. So when Ryan found a deal on a remote Airbnb cabin in the woods, it seemed like a no-brainer. The photos showed a cozy, rustic house with a wraparound porch, large windows overlooking the trees, and a fire pit out back. "This is perfect," Ryan had said, sending the link to their group chat. The others agreed. A little isolation, a couple of beers, and no responsibilities for 2 days. It sounded ideal. When they arrived, though, the place didn't exactly match the photos. It wasn't drastically different, but the cabin looked older, like it had aged 20 years since the pictures were taken. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the porch creaked with every step they took. Mark joked that it gave the place character, but Ethan muttered under his breath that it looked more like something out of a horror movie. Still, they were there, and the inside seemed cozy enough. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the furniture looked like it had been bought secondhand, but it was clean. The first odd thing happened within an hour of them settling in. Luke had wandered off to explore the upstairs rooms while the others unpacked groceries in the kitchen. When he came back down, he looked pale. "There's a weird smell up there," he said, "like rotting meat or something." Ryan shrugged it off, suggesting it might just be an old house thing. "We're in the middle of the woods," he said, "probably just a dead animal in the walls." They all laughed it off, but Ethan gave Luke a look, as if silently asking if he was sure. Luke just shook his head and went to grab a beer. That night, the first real sign that something wasn't right happened. They had built a fire in the pit out back and were sitting around telling stupid stories. Mark, always the prankster, had started making exaggerated ghost sounds, waving his hands in the air like a cartoon spirit. But just as they were all laughing, they heard it. A faint knock coming from inside the house. Everyone froze. The knock came again, louder this time, like someone was knocking on the wall from the inside. "Probably the pipes," Ryan said, though his voice sounded less confident than usual. Ethan stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the table. "I'll check it out," he said. The others followed him reluctantly, leaving the comfort of the fire behind. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. They split up, each checking different rooms. Ryan went to the living room, Mark to the kitchen, and Ethan and Luke headed upstairs. The smell Luke had mentioned earlier was stronger now, an almost metallic tang in the air. They didn't find anything unusual. No loose pipes, no drafts, no animals scratching at the walls. Still, the unease lingered. They tried to shake it off, but that night, none of them slept well. Ryan claimed he heard footsteps outside his window around 2 a.m., but when he looked, no one was there. Ethan said he thought he heard whispering from the hallway, but Luke and Mark were both dead asleep. By morning, everyone was on edge, though no one wanted to admit it outright. "We're just freaking ourselves out," Ryan said over coffee. "This place is old. Old houses make weird noises." But as the day went on, things escalated. Mark was in the kitchen making lunch when he screamed so loudly that the others ran to him in a panic. He was standing by the sink, staring at the window above it. "There was someone out there," he stammered, his face pale. "I swear, someone was just standing there, looking in." They rushed outside, but there was no one there. No footprints. No signs of anyone having been near the cabin. They tried to convince Mark he was imagining things, but his panic was contagious. Even Ryan, who'd been the voice of reason all morning, couldn't hide the unease creeping over him. Luke was the one who finally said what everyone else was thinking. "Maybe we should just pack up and leave." His words hung in the air, heavy and tempting, but Ryan shook his head. "We paid for the weekend," he said, though his tone wasn't as confident as it had been. "It's probably just locals messing with us. We can't let them scare us off." By the time the sun began to set, it felt like the cabin itself had turned against them. The smell upstairs had spread, now so overwhelming that none of them could stay on the second floor for long. Ethan had tried to open the windows to air it out, but they wouldn't budge. They were stuck, sealed shut as if they hadn't been touched in years. Downstairs wasn't much better. The lights flickered intermittently, even though Ryan swore he'd checked the wiring when they arrived. And then there were the sounds, scratches in the walls, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Around 9 p.m., they decided to distract themselves with a card game. They gathered around the small dining table, beers in hand, forcing themselves to laugh at Mark's terrible jokes. For a while, it almost worked. But then, Ethan noticed something. He'd been shuffling the deck, preparing to deal, when he froze. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "did any of you write on these cards?" They leaned in to look. At first, the cards seemed normal. Aces, kings, queens, but as Ethan spread them out, they saw it. Scrawled in shaky black ink on some of the cards were words: "Leave, get out, you're not safe." The laughter stopped. "This isn't funny," Ryan said, his voice sharp. "Which one of you did this?" No one answered. They all looked at each other, searching for a hint of guilt, but there was nothing. Luke pushed his chair back abruptly. "I'm done. I'm not staying here another second," he said, grabbing his coat. Before anyone could stop him, he threw open the front door and froze. The others crowded behind him, peering out into the night. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, was completely silent. And then they saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall, unmoving silhouette just watching them. "Who the hell is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Ryan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Hey!" he shouted into the night. "Who's out there?" The figure didn't move. It didn't respond. It just stood there, its presence oppressive and unnatural. Ryan turned back to the group. "I'm going out there," he said. Ethan grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We don't know who or what that is." But Ryan shook him off and stepped outside, the others reluctantly following. As they approached the figure, it became clear something was wrong. Its shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its head tilted at an impossible angle. And then, just as they were close enough to make out its face, if it even had one, it disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had been swallowed by the darkness. They ran back inside, slamming the door behind them. "What the hell was that?" Luke shouted, his voice shaking. No one had an answer. They locked the doors and windows, though deep down, They all knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was out there, or in there, wasn't something they could keep out with a deadbolt. The final straw came just after midnight. They were sitting in the living room, huddled together on the couch, when the lights went out completely. The darkness was suffocating, the kind that makes you feel like you're being swallowed whole. And then the sound started. It was faint at first, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It grew louder, closer, until it was all around them. And then the banging began. It came from everywhere: the walls, the ceiling, the floors. Violent, deafening thuds that made the whole cabin shake. Mark screamed, covering his ears, while Ethan shouted something no one could hear. The growling turned into a roar, a horrible, inhuman sound that made their bones ache. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. They sat there, frozen, until Ryan finally spoke. "We need to leave, now." But when they tried the front door, it wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't budge. They were trapped. They were trapped. Every door, every window, nothing would open. The air inside the cabin felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on their lungs. Mark was hyperventilating, clutching his chest as if he couldn't breathe. "We're gonna die here," he whimpered, rocking back and forth. Ryan grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. "No one's dying. We're getting out of here. I don't care how, but we're getting out." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. He was just as terrified as the rest of them. Luke had grabbed a chair and was slamming it against the window, each hit sending shards of glass cracking but not breaking completely. Come on," he yelled, his frustration boiling over. Ethan joined him, and together they tried to force their way out. But it was useless. The windows wouldn't give. The walls seemed to absorb every blow, almost mocking their desperation. Then they heard it again. The growl, but this time it wasn't distant. It wasn't muffled. It was inside the cabin. They froze, their eyes darting around the room. The sound was low and guttural, reverberating through the floorboards and walls. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Ryan grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, holding it out in front of him like a weapon. "Whatever you are, come out," he shouted, his voice cracking. There was no answer, only silence. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, they echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was walking wanted them to hear every single step. They all turned toward the staircase, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The upstairs hallway was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt alive, like it was staring back at you. "It's up there," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark shook his head violently. "I'm not going up there. I'm not doing it." But Ryan had already started toward the stairs. "We have to know what we're dealing with," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped the fire poker. The others reluctantly followed, their footsteps creaking on the wooden stairs. Each step felt like it might give way, dropping them into some endless void. When they reached the top, the smell hit them like a punch to the face. That same rotting stench. Only now, it was so overpowering that they had to cover their noses. The hallway stretched out in front of them, the doors to the bedrooms all slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. "Which room?" Luke whispered. No one answered. They didn't need to. The last door at the end of the hall was wide open, and from inside, they could hear a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. Ethan reached out to grab Ryan's arm. "Don't," he said, his voice shaking. "Whatever's in there, it's not human." But Ryan shrugged him off. "We can't just stand here," he said, though his own voice was barely above a whisper. He stepped forward, the others reluctantly trailing behind him. The room at the end of the hall was the master bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and stained with something dark. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for them to see the sliver of blackness inside. Ryan raised the fire poker, his hands trembling. "Whoever's in there, come out!" he shouted. Silence, and then the door burst open. A figure lunged out of the closet, moving so fast they barely had time to react. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face, a horrifying mix of human and something else entirely. Its eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It let out a guttural scream, a sound so loud and piercing that they all dropped to their knees, clutching their ears. Ryan swung the fire poker wildly, hitting the creature, but it didn't even flinch. It grabbed him, its long, bony fingers wrapping around his neck. He gasped for air, his eyes bulging as he tried to fight it off. "Help me!" he choked out, but the others were frozen in terror. Mark was crying, Luke was backing away toward the door, and Ethan was rooted to the spot, his mouth open in a silent scream. Suddenly, the creature threw Ryan across the room like he weighed nothing. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor, motionless. The thing turned its head toward the others, its neck twisting at an unnatural angle. It smiled, or at least, it looked like a smile, and then it charged. They scattered, running for their lives. Mark tripped over the corner of the bed and went down hard, the creature pouncing on him before he could get back up. His screams echoed through the cabin, cut off abruptly as the creature dragged him back toward the closet. "Mark!" Ethan screamed, but Luke grabbed him. "We can't save him!" he shouted. "We have to go!" They bolted down the stairs, the creature's growls and Mark's muffled cries following them. The front door was still locked, but Ethan grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and smashed it against the glass. This time, it shattered. They didn't think twice. They climbed through the broken window, cutting themselves on the shards, but too panicked to care. They ran into the woods, the darkness swallowing them whole. Behind them, they could hear the creature's growls growing fainter, but they didn't stop. They didn't look back. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing miles from the cabin. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. Then Luke whispered, "Where's Ryan?" They all looked around, the realization sinking in. Ryan hadn't made it out. Ethan started to cry, but Luke grabbed him by the shoulders. "We have to keep moving," he said. "Whatever that thing is, it could still be following us." But as they stood there, trying to decide which way to go, a sound broke through the silence. A low, guttural growl, coming from the direction they'd just come. They froze, their blood turning to ice. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Ryan. But something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His eyes were black voids, just like the creature's. He smiled, his lips curling in a way that wasn't human. "Why are you running?" he asked, his voice distorted, layered with something else. The fun's just getting started. And then the growls started again, coming from all around them, closing in. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mort Effects for more real and true stories like this.